Why does the same story keep happening? You finally leave the relationship that hurt you, convinced you've learned your lesson. Months later, you meet someone completely different. Different face, different voice, different life. Yet somehow the ending feels strangely familiar. Or maybe your life looks successful from the outside. You have a stable job, people who care about you, and nothing is obviously wrong. But every morning, a quiet feeling follows you. A sense that something isn't where it's supposed to be. Like you've walked into the right house, but somehow ended up in the wrong life. Most people assume these experiences are random, bad luck, poor timing, coincidence. Carl Jung believed something very different. He argued that beneath every conscious decision lies another intelligence quietly shaping the direction of our lives, an invisible part of the mind that remembers everything we ignore, stores every emotion we refuse to feel, and patiently influences our choices without ever asking for permission. We like to believe we're rational creatures, that we choose who we love, what we fear, and where we go because we carefully think things through. But what if that's only part of the story? Imagine your life as a car speeding down a long highway. You believe you're sitting behind the wheel, deciding every turn, every stop, every destination. But hidden in the back seat is a silent passenger. It rarely speaks. It never grabs your attention. Yet every now and then it leans forward and gently moves the steering wheel. You don't notice it happen. You simply arrive somewhere and wonder how you got there. Jung called this passenger the unconscious. It isn't evil, it isn't magical, and it certainly isn't separate from you. It is you, the larger part of you that exists beneath awareness. The memories you've buried, the desires you've denied, the fears you've refused to confront, the talents you've neglected, the wounds you've convinced yourself no longer matter. The strange thing is that the unconscious never truly stays hidden. When it cannot speak directly, it finds other ways. It appears as recurring dreams, as irrational anxieties, as powerful attractions towards certain people, as the strange feeling that your life has somehow drifted away from the person you were meant to become. The more we ignore these signals, the louder they become. Eventually, what begins as a quiet discomfort can transform into anxiety, burnout, depression, or the painful realization that you've spent years climbing a ladder that was leaning against the wrong wall. Jung warned that the greatest danger isn't making mistakes. The greatest danger is living unconsciously. Because when you refuse to understand the forces moving beneath the surface, they don't disappear. They simply begin making your decisions for you. This is why so many people wake up one day feeling like strangers inside their own lives. Not because life betrayed them, but because they spent years following a map they never consciously chose. Learning to listen to the unconscious isn't about becoming mystical or escaping reality. It's about returning to it. It's about discovering the hidden forces that have quietly shaped your relationships, your ambitions, your fears, and even your identity. Because until you learn to hear that silent passenger, you may spend your entire life believing you're holding the steering wheel when all along someone else has been choosing the direction. If the unconscious is always speaking, why do so few people ever hear it? The answer isn't that the voice is too quiet, it's that our lives have become too loud. From the moment we wake up, our attention is pulled in 100 different directions. Notifications demand an immediate response. Headlines compete for outrage. Endless videos promise another answer, another shortcut, another distraction. Every empty moment is filled before silence has the chance to arrive. We have become experts at escaping ourselves. But the noise isn't only outside us. There is another voice that rarely stops talking. The one constantly explaining, judging, comparing, planning, defending. The voice that says, be practical. Don't overthink it. That feeling doesn't make sense. Ignore it and keep moving. Jung called this part of our identity the ego. The ego is necessary. Without it, we couldn't navigate the world. It organizes our experiences, builds our identity, and allows us to function from one day to the next. But the ego has one fatal weakness. It believes it already knows who you are. It clings to a carefully constructed image of itself and defends that image at all costs. Every uncomfortable emotion becomes something to suppress. Every contradiction becomes something to explain away. Every unexpected desire becomes an inconvenience. Over time, the ego builds a fortress. Inside its walls are all the things you're willing to admit about yourself. Outside those walls lies everything you've rejected. The parts that seem too emotional, too weak, too angry, too creative, too vulnerable, too ambitious, too strange. None of these parts disappear. They simply wait. The stronger the fortress becomes, the harder it is for anything outside of it to be heard. But there is another wall that separates us from ourselves. Jung called it the persona. Think about how many versions of yourself exist. The professional version, the confident version, the agreeable version, the version that smiles when exhausted, the version that says, "I'm fine," while quietly falling apart. None of these masks are necessarily dishonest. Every society requires some adaptation. We all play roles. We all adjust depending on where we are and who we're with. The problem begins when the mask becomes more familiar than the face beneath it. When you become so committed to being who others expect that you slowly forget who you are without an audience. This is one of the greatest tragedies Jung observed. Many people don't lose themselves in a single dramatic moment. They lose themselves one acceptable decision at a time, one compromise, one performance, one carefully managed version of themselves after another, until eventually the real personality exists only in fragments, hidden somewhere beyond awareness. And yet, the unconscious never gives up trying to reach you. It simply speaks a language the ego was never taught to understand. It doesn't argue with logic. It doesn't send neatly organized paragraphs. It communicates through symbols, a dream where you're wandering through an abandoned house, a recurring image of deep water, a staircase that never seems to end, a child calling your name. To the logical mind, these are meaningless stories. To the unconscious, they are messages wrapped in metaphor. It also speaks through the body. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt uneasy without knowing why? Met someone who seemed perfectly kind, yet something inside you refused to trust them? Felt a tightness in your chest every Sunday evening before work? Or experienced a strange sense of peace after making a decision that terrified you? Your body often notices what your conscious mind has not yet accepted. Before you can explain something, you often feel it. The unconscious also appears through what we call irrational impulses, a sudden urge to change careers despite having every reason to stay, an unexpected fascination with a book, a place, or a person you can't explain, an overwhelming desire to create something after years of believing you weren't creative. These moments often seem random. Jung believed they rarely are. They are small openings through which the deeper personality attempts to emerge. The tragedy is that most of us dismiss them almost immediately. We're just being emotional. That's unrealistic. I should be more practical. So the door closes once again. Imagine the unconscious like an endless night stretching beyond the edge of a small campfire. The fire is your conscious awareness. It illuminates only a few feet around you. Within that circle, everything feels understandable, predictable, safe. But beyond the light lies an ancient landscape. Dark forests where forgotten memories still wander. Silent lakes reflecting faces you've never dared become. Mountains hiding possibilities you've spent years avoiding. Shapes move between the trees. Sometimes they approach the edge of the firelight. Sometimes they retreat before you can recognize them. Most people spend their entire lives staring into the flames, convinced that the fire is all there is. Very few gather the courage to look beyond it, because the night is unsettling. It refuses certainty. It refuses simple answers. And yet, Every path toward becoming who you truly are begins by stepping away from the comfort of the fire and allowing your eyes to slowly adjust to the darkness. Not because the darkness is where you lose yourself, but because, more often than not, it's where you've been waiting for yourself all along. If the unconscious speaks in symbols, how do you answer? This was the question that consumed Carl Jung for years. He didn't want theories, he wanted a method, a way to consciously enter into conversation with the parts of the mind that normally remained hidden. That method became known as active imagination. Despite the mysterious name, it isn't about escaping reality. It's about paying attention to a reality you've ignored for most of your life. The first mistake people make is confusing active imagination with ordinary daydreaming. They couldn't be more different. When you daydream, your mind drifts wherever it wants. You become a spectator. One image leads to another, and before you know it, you've spent 10 minutes imagining conversations that never happened, or replaying memories that no longer matter. You aren't directing the experience, you're being carried by it. Active imagination works in the opposite direction. Instead of wandering unconsciously through your imagination, you enter it consciously. You remain awake, present, observant. You don't invent a story, you discover one. Jung often described it as meeting autonomous parts of the psyche, as if forgotten pieces of yourself have been patiently waiting for the moment you finally decided to listen. This isn't about controlling the imagination. It's about participating with it. So how do you actually do it? The first step is surprisingly simple. Lower the threshold between the conscious and unconscious mind. During a normal day, the ego dominates your attention. It jumps from thought to thought, constantly planning, judging, and solving problems. It's difficult to hear anything deeper while this constant commentary is running. So the first task is to quiet it. Some people sit in complete darkness. Others meditate until their thoughts slow down. Some walk alone for long periods. Others find the rhythm of drawing, breathing, or repetitive movement creates the same effect. The method itself matters less than the result. You are creating enough silence for something beneath your ordinary thoughts to become noticeable. Not forcing, not chasing, simply waiting. Eventually, something appears. This brings us to the second step. Invite the image. Don't begin with an elaborate fantasy. Begin with whatever already exists. Perhaps you remember a fragment from last night's dream. A strange figure standing in the distance. A locked door, a river you couldn't cross. Or maybe there is no dream at all. Instead, begin with a feeling. Anxiety, loneliness, jealousy, grief. Don't analyze it. Give it a form. If your anxiety was standing in front of you, what would it look like? Would it be a child, an old man, a faceless stranger, a wolf watching from the trees, a storm moving across the ocean? Don't choose what sounds impressive. Notice what arrives on its own. The unconscious rarely speaks with the images we'd expect. Once the image becomes clear, do something most people never think to do. Speak to it. This is the third step, the dialogue. Ask it a question. Why are you here? What are you trying to show me? What do you want? What have I refused to see? Then, wait. This is where almost everyone fails. The ego wants to answer immediately. It wants to take control of the conversation. It wants to invent something clever. Resist that impulse. Remain still. Allow the response to emerge on its own. Sometimes it arrives as words. Sometimes another image appears. Sometimes the figure changes shape. Sometimes nothing happens for several minutes. That silence is part of the process. The goal isn't to force an answer. The goal is to create enough space for one to appear. Jung insisted on something that sounds almost impossible at first. Treat the figure as if it possesses its own perspective. Not because it is literally another person, but because it represents a part of your own mind that your conscious identity doesn't fully understand. The moment you begin scripting both sides of the conversation, the exercise ends. Your job isn't to perform, your job is to witness. Now, this is probably the point where some of you are thinking, wait, this sounds completely insane. Talking to imaginary people, having conversations with symbols. Isn't this just pretending? It's a fair question. And Jung anticipated it long before anyone watching this video did. Here's what modern psychology has repeatedly discovered. Your brain responds to imagined experiences in remarkably similar ways to real ones. Think about a nightmare. Nothing actually happened, yet your heart races, your breathing changes, your muscles tense. Your body reacts as though the experience were unfolding in front of you. Or imagine biting into a fresh lemon. Even without a real lemon in your hand, many people can almost taste the sourness. Their mouths begin to water. A simple mental image produces a genuine physical response. The mind does not treat every internal experience as just imagination. Symbols carry emotional reality. They activate memories, beliefs, fears, and desires that ordinary reasoning often cannot reach. This is why a dream can haunt you for years. Why a single image in a film can change the way you see your own life. Why a metaphor can reveal something that 100 logical explanations never could. Active imagination works with this same principle. It gives the unconscious a language it already understands. You are not pretending that the symbols are literally alive. You are recognizing that they represent living psychological forces within you. And when those forces are finally allowed to speak, they often reveal truths the conscious mind has been trying to avoid for years. That is why Jung didn't treat imagination as an escape from reality. He treated it as one of the deepest paths back to it. But there is a danger. The same imagination that can reveal the truth can also become the perfect place to hide from it. This is why Jung repeatedly warned people not to approach the unconscious carelessly, because not every voice inside your head belongs to the unconscious. Sometimes, it's simply the ego wearing a different mask. Imagine standing in front of an old mirror. You hope it will show you who you really are, but instead it reflects the person you desperately wish you were. Stronger, wiser, more important, more misunderstood. The image feels comforting. It tells you exactly what you've always wanted to hear. The problem is, comfort and truth are not the same thing. Many people become fascinated with inner work because they secretly expect validation. They want the unconscious to confirm that they're special, that everyone who hurt them was simply jealous, that every failure was someone else's fault, that they already possess hidden greatness waiting to be recognized. The ego loves stories like these. It feeds on them because they protect its image. They require no real change, only admiration. This is the fantasy trap. Instead of using imagination to confront reality, we begin using it to escape reality. The unconscious slowly disappears, and the ego takes over the conversation. It starts writing the dialogue, playing every character, answering every difficult question before it's even asked. The experience feels profound, but nothing actually changes. This is one of the hardest truths Jung ever accepted. The unconscious is not interested in making you feel important. It is interested in making you whole. And those are very different goals. Wholeness demands sacrifice. It asks you to surrender the stories you've built around yourself. The stories of being permanently innocent, permanently right, permanently misunderstood. The unconscious has no interest in protecting those illusions. It tears them apart. So how do you know the difference? How do you know whether you're encountering something genuine or simply listening to your own ego? Jung offered a remarkably simple test. Pay attention to your reaction. Authentic encounters with the unconscious are rarely flattering. More often they are surprising, sometimes even offensive. They reveal qualities you've spent years denying. They expose motives you never wanted to admit. They challenge the identity you've carefully defended. Imagine asking the unconscious What am I missing? You expect it to point towards your hidden talents. Instead, it points towards your arrogance. You expect reassurance. Instead, it reveals fear. You expect wisdom. Instead, it reminds you of an apology you've avoided for years. That's the difference. The ego protects your self-image. The unconscious expands it. One tells you what feels good. The other tells you what you need. This doesn't mean every uncomfortable thought is automatically true. Not every harsh inner voice is wisdom. Sometimes guilt is irrational. Sometimes shame is inherited. Sometimes self-criticism is simply another disguise worn by the ego. Discernment is essential. Jung never suggested blindly obeying every image or impulse that emerged from the unconscious. He encouraged dialogue, reflection, questioning. The goal is not obedience. The goal is understanding. Because symbols don't give commands, they reveal conflicts, and only a conscious mind can decide how to respond. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding about Jung's work is the belief that self-discovery is always liberating. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is devastating. Because once you've seen something clearly, you can't return to ignorance. Once you recognize that your resentment has been poisoning your relationships, you can't honestly pretend it's everyone else's fault. Once you realize you've spent years living only to satisfy other people's expectations, you can't convincingly tell yourself you're fulfilled. Once you discover the life you've been avoiding, the life you're currently living begins to feel impossible to ignore. This is why Jung believed inner work carries a moral responsibility. Opening the door to the unconscious isn't entertainment. It isn't a personality test. It isn't a collection of mystical experiences to talk about over coffee. It is an encounter with truth, and truth always asks something in return. If the unconscious reveals that you've betrayed yourself, what will you do about it? If it reveals that you've hurt someone, will you make it right? If it shows you a path you've been afraid to walk, will you take the first step? Or will you quietly close the door and pretend the conversation never happened? Jung believed this was the moment that truly defined a person, not the moment they discovered the truth, but the moment they decided whether they were willing to live by it. Because insight alone changes nothing. You can understand yourself perfectly and still continue living exactly the same way. Knowledge becomes transformation only when it demands action. That is the price of looking into the mirror. You don't just discover who you are, you become responsible for becoming that person. If active imagination ended with a conversation, it would be nothing more than an interesting exercise. The real work begins after the dialogue is over. Because the unconscious doesn't ask to be admired, it asks to be integrated. Imagine a diver descending into the depths of the ocean. Far below the surface, hidden beneath years of darkness, they discover a chest filled with gold. The discovery is extraordinary. But if the treasure remains on the ocean floor, nothing has changed. Its value exists only as potential. The diver must carry it back to the surface. Only then can it become part of ordinary life. This is what Jung meant by integration. The unconscious may reveal forgotten talents, painful memories, hidden fears, or neglected desires. But insight alone has no power. It only becomes meaningful when it changes the way you live. This is where many people make another mistake. They assume every message from the unconscious must be obeyed. It must not. The unconscious is not a king issuing commands. It is a messenger. Its role is to reveal what the ego cannot see. The ego's role is to respond wisely. Jung believes psychological health depends on a negotiation between the two. Imagine your unconscious reveals a powerful feeling of anger you've spent years suppressing. The answer isn't to explode at everyone around you, nor is it to push the anger back into the shadows. Both extremes ignore the message. Instead, you ask a deeper question. What is this anger protecting? What boundary has been crossed? What truth have I been afraid to speak? Perhaps the answer isn't rage, perhaps it's learning to say no. Perhaps it's leaving an unhealthy relationship. Perhaps it's finally admitting that your life has been shaped by fear rather than choice. The feeling points towards a problem. Your conscious mind decides how to solve it. Or imagine your unconscious repeatedly presents images of painting, writing, music, or building something with your hands. The message isn't necessarily to quit your job tomorrow and gamble everything on becoming an artist. That would be another form of imbalance. Instead, the negotiation might be much smaller. An hour each evening spent creating, a weekend dedicated to learning a forgotten skill, a life that finally makes room for a neglected part of yourself. Integration is rarely dramatic. More often, it happens through small decisions repeated consistently over time. This is where psychology becomes practical, because the unconscious doesn't exist only during dreams or meditation. It quietly influences nearly every important decision you make. Think about careers. Many people choose a profession because it earns approval. It satisfies their parents. It provides security. It looks successful from the outside. Years later, they feel exhausted by a life that never truly belonged to them. The unconscious often recognizes this long before the conscious mind does. It begins sending signals: persistent boredom, a feeling of emptiness after achievements that were supposed to feel meaningful, recurring dreams about roads, trains, unfinished journeys, or forgotten homes. These aren't necessarily instructions to abandon everything overnight. They are invitations to ask a difficult question: whose life am I actually living? The same principle appears in relationships. Sometimes we are drawn toward people who awaken forgotten parts of ourselves. Sometimes we repeatedly choose people who recreate familiar wounds. Without understanding the unconscious patterns beneath these attractions, we mistake repetition for destiny. We say, "This is just my type," when in reality it may simply be an old psychological wound, searching for another chance to be understood. As these hidden patterns become conscious, something remarkable happens. Relationships stop feeling like mysteries, they become mirrors. You begin recognizing why certain people immediately trigger anger, why others awaken unexpected peace, why some connections feel strangely familiar despite only meeting yesterday. You stop asking, "Why does this always happen to me?" and begin asking, "What part of me keeps participating in this pattern?" That single shift changes everything. Even your inner world begins to transform, not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because you are no longer fighting yourself. There is a quiet kind of peace that emerges when your outer life gradually begins reflecting your inner reality. Not perfection, alignment. Jung believed this was one of the deepest forms of psychological healing, a life where fewer and fewer parts of yourself need to remain hidden. Perhaps no one understood this better than Jung himself. In 1913, following his break with Sigmund Freud, Jung entered one of the most difficult periods of his life. The beliefs that had guided his career were collapsing. He experienced vivid visions, powerful dreams, and overwhelming inner images that left him questioning his own sanity. Most people would have tried to suppress them. Jung did the opposite. He wrote them down, he painted them, he entered into dialogue with the figures that appeared before him. He refused to dismiss them simply because they seemed irrational. Those encounters eventually became the Red Book, a work unlike anything else in psychology. It wasn't written as a textbook. It was the record of a man learning to confront the unknown within himself, rather than running from it. Jung later believed that many of the psychological ideas for which he became famous grew out of those encounters, not because the unconscious handed him finished answers, but because he was willing to wrestle with its questions. That is what integration looks like. Not blind belief, not blind obedience, a conversation, a negotiation, a willingness to let truth reshape the way you live. Because the greatest discoveries of the unconscious are not meant to remain hidden in journals, dreams, or private moments of reflection. They are meant to become visible in the choices you make, in the relationships you build, in the person you slowly become. At the beginning of this video, we asked a simple question. Why do we keep repeating the same patterns? Why do we end up in the same relationships, the same disappointments, the same quiet feeling that something about our lives doesn't quite belong to us? Jung's answer was never that we lacked intelligence, or discipline, or motivation. His answer was that much of our lives are shaped by forces we have never learned to recognize. The unconscious isn't some distant, mystical place hidden from ordinary people. It is woven into every decision you make, every relationship you build, every fear you avoid, every dream that refuses to leave you alone. The question is not whether it influences your life. The question is whether you will become aware of its influence, because there are really only two ways to live. The first is as a divided person, one part of you chasing success while another quietly longs for meaning. One part smiling for everyone else while another carries grief in silence. One part making decisions while another sabotages them from the shadows. This division creates friction. You begin fighting battles you cannot even name. You wonder why every achievement feels incomplete, why every victory fades so quickly, why life seems to resist you at every turn. But there is another possibility, a slower path, a more difficult path, the path of becoming whole. Not because every conflict disappears, but because the conflict finally becomes conscious. The parts of yourself that once worked against each other slowly begin working together. The ego no longer spends all its energy pretending. The unconscious no longer needs to shout through anxiety, recurring dreams, or painful repetitions. Instead, a dialogue begins. The conscious mind learns to listen. The unconscious learns to trust that it will finally be heard. This is what Jung called individuation. Not becoming someone new, but becoming the person you have quietly been beneath all the roles, expectations, and defenses. Perhaps that journey begins with something incredibly small. A dream you decide to write down tomorrow morning. A strange symbol you've never been able to forget. A recurring image that keeps appearing throughout your life. Or a feeling you've spent years trying to explain away. Instead of pushing it aside, pause. Become curious. Ask it why it has stayed with you for so long. You may not receive an answer immediately. The unconscious has never been in a hurry. It has been waiting your entire life. If you've ever had a recurring dream, a symbol that has followed you for years, or an image that appeared during meditation or a difficult period in your life. Share it in the comments. Don't worry about interpreting it perfectly. Sometimes the most powerful part is simply giving the hidden a voice. You might even discover that someone else's experience reflects something you've never been able to put into words yourself. Because the conversation doesn't end when this video ends. If anything, this is where it begins. Carl Jung left us with a sentence that remains just as powerful today as it was nearly a century ago. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Maybe fate isn't something waiting for you in the future. Maybe it's a pattern you've been living without realizing it. And maybe the life you've been searching for has never been somewhere else. It has been quietly waiting beneath the surface for the moment you finally decide to listen.